$50 million doesn't vanish quietly.
$50 million doesn't vanish quietly. But somehow, it had. I was at my desk at midnight running what should have been a routine quarterly audit when the number stopped making sense. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that announced itself. It was subtle, a series of transfers, each one individually unremarkable, each one spaced far enough apart to avoid triggering the automated flags my financial team had spent years building into the system. Clean execution. Patient timing. Zero panic in the architecture. $50 million. Gone. I sat back in my chair and I did something I almost never do. Nothing. For about 3 full minutes I just sat there and looked at the screen. My name is Kong Min Jae. If that name carries weight where you're from, then you already understand why $50 million disappearing from my accounts isn't simply a financial problem. In my world, money is not just money. It is evidence of control. It is proof that Kong Min Jae sees everything, manages everything, and is never, not under any circumstances, caught off guard. Except I had been caught off guard. And when I started tracing the transfers, following each thread backward through the accounts, through the routing sequences, through the layers, every single one of them led to the same origin point. My home. My household accounts. My wife. Before we go any further, if you're new here, subscribe right now. I put out stories like this every week, and this one specifically, I need you to stay until the end. Because what Mallory actually did with that money is something that stopped me cold, and I think it'll do the same to you. Hit the bell, drop a comment when the twist lands, and trust me, you'll know when it lands. Okay. Back to the night I thought I understood my own life. Let me tell you about Mallory. Because if I don't, nothing that follows makes sense. And because for too long, longer than I'm proud of, I let the people around me define who she was without correcting them. Mallory is American. She grew up in Atlanta. She is a black woman with a kind of grounded steadiness that doesn't perform itself. She doesn't announce her presence. She doesn't need the room to adjust when she walks in, though it always does. She's the kind of woman who makes you feel, within 10 minutes of a conversation, that she has already thought about whatever you're about to say and decided she's interested in your version of it anyway. I met her 9 years ago at a private economic forum in Singapore. She was there representing a wealth management firm. I was there as the legitimate face of several legitimate business interests. We talked for 3 hours at a dinner that was supposed to last 90 minutes. I extended my trip by 4 days. We were married 18 months later. She knew what I was. I was clear about that. I have always believed that the people who choose proximity to my life deserve to know what they're choosing. She listened to everything. She asked questions that were sharper than I expected. And then she said she needed 2 weeks to think. She came back in 10 days. In 8 years of marriage, she had never given me a reason to question her. She ran our household, the private one, the real one, with a calm efficiency that I told myself I appreciated without ever stopping to consider what it cost her to operate inside my world the way she did. As a black American woman in Seoul, inside the private ecosystem of a Korean criminal organization, she navigated things daily that I never had to think about. My people were respectful because I required it. But respectful and welcoming are different things. And I was not always paying close enough attention to know which one she was actually getting. There were dinners, important dinners, the kind where the conversation at the table shaped real outcomes, where I watched someone redirect a question away from Mallory without even meaning to. Politely. Automatically. The way you redirect around furniture you've decided isn't part of the room. And Mallory would absorb it without reacting. Without flinching. She'd pick up her glass, shift the conversation somewhere else, and keep moving. I noticed it every time. And every time I told myself it was fine because I required respect and respect was what she was getting. I told myself she was fine. She seemed fine. She never complained. What I didn't understand then, what this whole story forced me to understand, is that Mallory had never been the kind of woman who waited for permission to be more than her circumstances allowed. She had simply been waiting for the right moment. And finding the right approach. And building the right structure. For 22 months. Right under my nose. I spent 4 hours that night doing nothing but following the money. Here is what I found. The transfers had begun 22 months ago. Small amounts first, individually unremarkable. 400,000 through a renovation budget account. 600,000 from an investment vehicle that Mallory had legitimate access to because I had given it to her. Deliberately. Because I trusted her with the household finances the way you trust a capable person with a domain you've assigned them, completely, within the boundary you've drawn, and without looking too closely at what happens inside it. As the months progressed, the amounts increased. But the sophistication of the routing grew simultaneously, longer intervals, different sequencing, a pattern that kept evolving as if whoever was executing it was actively learning the system's blind spots and adjusting in real time. That stopped me. Because that level of financial intelligence, that specific ability to map an architecture, identify its vulnerabilities, and adapt the strategy while the strategy is in motion, that's not improvised. That's not someone skimming opportunistically. That's someone who understood financial systems well enough to move through one without disturbing its surface. I thought about Mallory's background. Wealth management. 7 years before we met, at a firm in New York that I knew by reputation, serious institution, not entry-level work. She had left when we married because I had, and I'm going to be honest about this, made it clear that I preferred she not work externally. Privacy concerns, I'd told myself. Security considerations. Valid in my world. Also, I can see now, a way of keeping her contained to the space I had designed for her without quite admitting that's what I was doing. She had studied economics at Spelman. Graduated top of her class. I knew that. I had never thought about it for more than a few seconds combined in 8 years of marriage. It was relevant now. She knew exactly what she was doing. Which meant the question wasn't whether this was intentional. The question was, what was it for? I went to bed at 4. I was up by 6:30. Mallory was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. Moving through the space the way she always does in the morning, unhurried, coffee going, completely at ease in her own skin. She's always been like that in the mornings. Present in a way that takes up exactly as much space as it needs to and not 1 inch more. She turned when she heard me and said, "You were up late." "Quarterly review," I said. She looked at me. Just for a beat, a fraction of a second longer than the comment required. And in that beat, I caught something. Not guilt. Not fear. Something quieter than both of those. Something that looked, if I had to name it, like acknowledgement. She handed me coffee and turned back to what she was doing. I sat at the kitchen table and I watched her. Really watched her. 8 years of marriage and I was sitting there studying my wife like I was meeting her for the first time, trying to find the fracture, the tell, the thing I'd missed. She was completely calm. Not the performed calm of someone trying to appear innocent. I've been around enough people in compromised positions to know what that looks like, the overcorrection, the slight acceleration in speech, the eyes that move differently. None of that. This was something else. The calm of a person who has made a decision they are at peace with. Who has done what they intended to do and is prepared for whatever comes next. That was more unsettling than the 50 million. Because it meant she hadn't panicked. Hadn't second-guessed. Had simply waited. For me to find it. Knowing I would. Possibly calculating exactly when I would. I drank my coffee and I said nothing. And I thought, before I say a single word to her, I need to know where that money went. I have 3 people whose only job is information. Not operations, not enforcement, information. They find things, verify things, trace things through layers that most people don't know exist. My lead is a woman named Ji Hai. She's been with me for 9 years. She is precise, she is fast, and she does not editorialize. She gives me facts and lets me draw conclusions. I called her that afternoon and I gave her one instruction. Find out where the money went. Not who moved it. I knew who moved it. I needed the destination. She told me 48 hours. She came back in 34. She laid it out in a room in one of my secondary buildings. Nothing printed. Encrypted drive, destroyed after the meeting. Standard protocol. She said, the funds moved through 7 accounts across 4 jurisdictions before consolidating. The final destination is not a personal account. Not offshore holdings, not property conversion, not cryptocurrency. I said, then what? She turned her laptop toward me. I looked at a corporate registration document. A holding company, registered 19 months ago. The structure was, and I want to be precise here, impressively clean. Legally sound across multiple jurisdictions. Multi-layered in a way that suggested whoever built it understood not just the financial architecture but the legal environment around it in each territory. The company name meant nothing to me at first glance. But the operating subsidiaries did. 3 names I recognized. Not personally, professionally. Companies that had been quietly accumulating positions in a sector I had identified 2 years ago as strategically critical to the long-term future of my legitimate business operations. A sector I had been trying to enter for 3 years and kept hitting walls in. Walls that my team had produced 4 separate strategic analyses on without finding a workable entry point. Ji-Hai pulled up a second document. It was an internal strategic memo from my own organization. Dated 2 years and 8 months ago. Identifying exactly which companies were blocking my entry into that sector, why they were effective blockers, and what a viable alternative approach might look like. I recognized the document. I had been on the phone when it was being finalized. I remembered that day specifically because the conclusion had frustrated me. The analysis identified the problem clearly and offered no solution I was willing to implement at the time. I looked at the date on the holding company registration. It was filed 4 months after that memo. Ji-Hai pulled up a third set of documents. Property and operational records for the subsidiary companies. Acquisition timelines, pricing, strategic rationale for each purchase. All of it documented internally with a level of analytical clarity that was, I'm going to say this plainly, better than the work my own strategic team had been producing on the same problem. At the bottom of the third document was a note. Not typed. Handwritten, in a margin, in handwriting I knew as well as my own. Structural entry, not direct. The gate isn't the door. Mallory's handwriting. She hadn't just moved the money. She had built the strategy. She had written the analysis. She had identified the solution that my team hadn't found, built the vehicle to execute it, and deployed $50 million against it with enough discipline and precision that 18 months later the position was not only established but generating returns. I sat back in my chair. Ji-Hai said nothing. She's good at reading when silence is the correct response. After a long moment I said, the Incheon position in the subsidiary portfolio. What's the current valuation? Ji-Hai pulled up one more figure. The 50 million had grown. I drove for close to 2 hours after that meeting. I need you to understand what was happening inside me during those 2 hours, because it wasn't simple and it wasn't clean. Part of it was the shock of the financial picture, the realization that what I had been preparing to treat as a theft was something categorically different. That part was almost easier to process because it was concrete. Numbers. Structures. Things I could analyze. The harder part was something else entirely. I kept thinking about Ji-Hai's face when she showed me those documents. She's worked for me for 9 years. She has shown me information about some of the most powerful and dangerous people in this country. She does not react to information. That's one of the things that makes her exceptional. But when she pulled up Mallory's internal strategy documents, when the scope of what Mallory had built became visible on screen, I caught something on Jihai's face. Just for a second. Something that, in a different context, I would have called respect. And I thought about my organization. About the people in it. About the specific way they had treated Mallory for 8 years, correctly, because I required it. Professionally. Courteously. But with a baseline assumption that she was peripheral. That she was present because she was my wife and for no other operational reason. That whatever happened in my world, she was adjacent to it rather than capable of participating in it. I thought about those dinners. The redirected questions. The conversations that moved around her like water around a stone, not violently, not cruelly, just automatically. I thought about how many times she had been asked about Atlanta, about American food, about what she thought of Seoul, and never once, in 8 years, been asked what she thought about anything that actually mattered. I thought about what it costs a person to walk into a room and already know that the room has made its decision about you. To be a black woman in a Korean criminal organization's inner circle and understand, from the very first dinner, that respect and inclusion are not the same thing. That you can be tolerated completely and seen partially and that the two feel nothing alike from the inside. She had known that. She had lived inside that knowledge every single day for 8 years. And she had built a $50 million strategic play in the blind spot created by everyone who decided she wasn't worth watching. She hadn't just outmaneuvered my financial systems. She had outmaneuvered an entire culture of assumption. I pulled over on a bridge above the Han River and sat there for a long time. And I started to feel something I was not accustomed to feeling. Ashamed. She was in the study when I got home. Sitting with a book, lamp on, the house quiet around her. She looked up when I walked in and she put the book down immediately. She didn't pretend to keep reading. I sat down across from her. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said, Donggang Holdings. She held my gaze. Yes. 19 months. 22, if you count the planning phase. I spent the first 3 months on research before I moved anything. $50 million. 47.6 from your accounts. The remainder came from returns on the initial Gwangmyeong position. It's been partially self-funding for the last 9 months. I looked at her. You've been reinvesting the returns. The Gwangmyeong acquisition returned $14 million in 8 months. I put 10 back into the Incheon structure. The rest went elsewhere. She paused. I'll get to the elsewhere. The elsewhere. There was an elsewhere. I filed that and kept going. The internal memo, I said. The strategic analysis from my team. You read it. You were on the phone, she said. It was on your desk. I read it. And you built a solution to a problem my team spent 3 years failing to solve. She didn't look away. Your team kept trying to enter through the front. The front was locked. I went around. The gate isn't the door, I said, quoting her own margin note back at her. Something moved across her face. Just briefly. You saw that. Jihai is thorough. Mallory nodded slowly. Then she said, I know what this looks like from where you're sitting. I know what you were building toward before Jihai showed you where the money went. I know the version of this conversation you had in your head 2 days ago. The version I had 2 days ago, I said, was considerably louder than this one. I know. She said it without apology. Not coldly, she doesn't do things coldly. Just honestly. I need you to ask me the real question, Min-jae. Not the financial one. You've already solved the financial one. Ask me the real one. I looked at her for a long moment. Why didn't you come to me, I said. Why didn't you walk through the door and tell me, I see this problem, I have a solution, I want to help build this. Why did it have to be this way? She held my gaze and she said it without hesitating. Because you didn't have a door. I repeated it. I didn't have a door. Not for me, she said. Not for this. You have a door for the household. You have a door for our marriage, for our personal life. You've been a good husband inside the space you defined for us, Min Jae, and I want you to know I mean that. But the moment anything touched your world, your actual world, the door didn't exist. It wasn't locked. It simply wasn't there. I said nothing. Because I knew she was telling the truth and I was not ready to confirm it out loud yet. She leaned forward slightly. Do you know what it's like to be the smartest person in a room that has already decided your decoration? To watch men with half your training and a fraction of your instincts make decisions you could improve in your sleep, and to know that the reason nobody's asking is not because you haven't proven yourself but because they decided what you were before you walked in the door. She paused. I'm not just talking about being a woman in your world, Min Jae. I'm talking about being who I am. In this city. In this organization. I walked into every room already carrying something that made people comfortable making assumptions. And you let them. Because it was easier than expanding what you'd built to include me as something more than your wife. That landed exactly where she meant it to land. I said, I know. I'm not angry, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not sitting here with 8 years of resentment. I'm sitting here because I did something I believed in, and I did it the only way I could see to do it, and now we're in the part where we actually talk about it. She paused. This is the most direct conversation we've had about any of this in 8 years. I'd like to keep going if you're willing. Here is where the internal conflict hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Because I was sitting across from a woman who had accessed my private documents without authorization, moved significant funds without my knowledge, and operated a substantial financial entity under my radar for nearly 2 years. In my world, that description belongs to a specific category of response. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what the justification is. The response is fixed. Except. She had done all of that and built something that served my interests with a precision and strategic elegance that nobody I paid to do exactly that had managed to produce. And she hadn't done it for herself. The holding company wasn't structured to benefit her independently. Every position, every return, every acquisition pointed back into territory that served the long-term growth of what I had spent 15 years building. She had built it for me. Without asking for credit. Without telling me it existed. Without a guarantee that I would respond with anything other than the kind of consequence my world typically delivers. She had trusted that I was capable of seeing it clearly. I said, you mentioned an elsewhere. When we were talking about the returns. She reached beside her and placed a folder on the table between us. I opened it. Transaction records. A private foundation I had never seen before. Donations, structured carefully, over 14 months. 3 medical facilities. All of them outside Seoul. Rural areas. Underserved communities, the kind of places where the gap between what healthcare is supposed to look like and what it actually looks like is wide enough to cost people their lives. $3 million. Deployed quietly through the foundation over 14 months. Funding equipment. Staffing costs. Operational expenses for facilities that ran on budgets too small to do the job they were supposed to do. I looked at the locations. One of them was in South Chungcheong Province. My mother was from South Chungcheong Province. She died when I was 19 years old. She died because a rural clinic in that province did not have the diagnostic equipment to catch what was killing her early enough to do anything about it. I had gone back to that province 3 years after her death looking for the clinic, because I had some idea in my head about doing something. The clinic had closed by then. Funding issues. I had told Mallory that story once. One time. 7 years ago, on a night when I was not myself. I had told her once, briefly, and I had never mentioned it again. It was not the kind of memory I revisited out loud. I looked at the donation records for the South Chungcheong facility. It had received its first funding from Mallory's foundation 16 months ago. It was still open. It had upgraded its diagnostic imaging equipment in the last quarter. My hands were not steady. I want to be honest about that. I am a man who has maintained composure in rooms where my life was on the line, and sitting in my own study looking at a charitable foundation transaction record, my hands were not steady. I closed the folder. I looked at my wife. She was watching me with that particular stillness she has, the kind that doesn't press, doesn't perform, just holds space and lets you arrive at whatever you're going to arrive at in your own time. I said, "You remembered that." "I remember everything you tell me," she said quietly. "You don't tell me very much." "So I remember everything." That sentence went somewhere inside me and it stayed there. I said, very slowly, "You took $50 million from my accounts. Built a holding company that solved a strategic problem my team failed to solve for 3 years. Generated returns significant enough to self-fund continued operations. Used 3 million of those returns to fund rural medical facilities, including the one in the province where my mother's clinic closed. And then you sat at the breakfast table and handed me coffee and waited for me to find it." She said, "I couldn't figure out how to give you any of it through the front door. Because you didn't have one. So I found another way." I stood up. I walked to the window. I stood there with my back to her for a long moment. And then I said something I have said to almost no one in my adult life. "I'm sorry." She was quiet. "I built something," I said, "and I told myself I was protecting you by keeping you outside of it." That was true in some ways, and it was also a way of not having to make room. Not having to expand what I'd built to include you as something other than. I stopped. I underestimated you. Consistently. And I let the people around me do the same thing. And you had to move $50 million through 7 jurisdictions to get my attention. Mallory said, after a moment, "I didn't need your attention." I turned around. "I needed your respect," she said. "Attention I had. You've always paid attention to me, Min Jae. You just weren't sure what you were paying attention to." I sat in my office alone until almost 3 in the morning after that conversation. I thought about what it had cost her. Not the strategy, not the intelligence or the discipline or the financial architecture, though all of that was significant. I thought about the human cost of what she had done. She had spent 22 months operating in complete isolation with something enormous. No one to consult. No one to reality check the decisions with. No partner to absorb the risk alongside her. She had carried the weight of $50 million in motion, a building corporate structure, a charitable foundation, and the full knowledge that if any piece of it went wrong, if the market moved badly, if the structure was discovered before it was stable, if I had responded with the fury that my world would have expected, she would have had nothing to stand on. She had done all of it alone. Because I had, over 8 years, made it structurally impossible for her to do it any other way. And she had never complained. Never given me a version of this conversation in installments. Nothing. I thought about what kind of discipline that required. What kind of strength. The specific kind of strength that comes from spending years being excellent in a room that has decided your excellence is irrelevant, and choosing to keep going anyway. Not for the room. For yourself. Because you know what you are even when nobody around you is willing to see it. I thought about Atlanta. About a woman who graduated top of her class at Spelman and went to New York and built a career at a serious firm and then married a Korean man who ran a criminal organization and moved to Seoul and, what? What had I actually thought she was doing with herself? What had I imagined filled the space of her interior life that I had never once asked about? I had thought she was fine. She seemed fine. She was capable and calm and present and warm and good company, and I had told myself that was enough. It was never enough. I had married a woman with Mallory's mind and Mallory's capability and Mallory's specific kind of quiet, focused, undefeatable ambition, and I had handed her a household to manage and told myself I was being good to her. I owed her a great deal more than an apology. My financial team had flagged the discrepancy. They'd identified the missing funds but hadn't yet fully traced the destination. They had escalated internally, which meant within 48 hours, my financial security people would be conducting their own investigation. And when they found Donggang Holdings, when they found Mallory's name on the registration, they would reach the same initial conclusion I had reached 2 nights ago. In my world, that conclusion carries weight. Not because anyone would move against Mallory, no one in my network would touch her. But because of what it would mean for perception. That Min Jae's wife had extracted $50 million and he hadn't seen it coming. That there was a vulnerability in his most private space. Reputation in my world is structural. It holds things together. And I had roughly 36 hours to get ahead of the story before the story wrote itself. I called my 3 most senior people into a meeting. My financial director, my operations head, and my legal counsel. I walked them through Donggang Holdings. All of it, the structure, the subsidiary acquisitions, the strategic rationale, the return figures. I presented it the way you present something that was yours from the beginning. I said, capital deployment on this project has been ongoing for 22 months. The structure is legally clean across all 4 jurisdictions. I want formal integration documentation prepared within the week and I want the Incheon position reviewed by end of month. My financial director said carefully, the internal flag from the transfer sequencing was accurate in identification, I said. Wrong in interpretation. The transfers were authorized. Clear it. He nodded. My legal counsel said, the registration on Donggang, the named director. Going forward you'll want to consider whether to. My wife's name stays on the registration, I said. The room went still. That particular kind of still that happens when something shifts in a space that's been arranged a certain way for a long time. She built it, I said. She is the operating director. What changes is that Donggang is now formally recognized as a subsidiary interest of the primary holdings, with full resources available to its director as needed. I looked around the table. I want every person in this room to understand clearly what I'm telling you. Is there any ambiguity? Nobody said there was ambiguity. Good. Then let's talk about the next phase of the Incheon position. I've reviewed the strategy and I have questions. Here is what I did not anticipate. I expected the adjustment to take time. For people to recalibrate slowly, with the awkwardness that accompanies any significant shift in the understood order of things. What happened instead was faster than that. And it came from a different direction. Within 2 weeks of Dongang's formal integration, Mallory was running operational meetings with the subsidiary teams. Not meetings I arranged for her, meetings she called herself, with the quiet authority of someone who has always known the material and is simply, finally, in a room where the material is on the table. I sat in on one of those meetings. I sat to her right and I watched her work. She has a quality I don't have. I control rooms through force of presence, through the weight of what people know about me, through the specific gravity of my reputation. It works. But it keeps people at a distance that isn't always useful. Mallory opens rooms. She asks questions that make people feel like their answer actually matters to the outcome, because it does. She synthesizes information from multiple people simultaneously and reflects it back in a way that advances the conversation rather than just demonstrating her own understanding of it. She leads without the room feeling like it's being led. I watched my senior financial director, a man who had been professionally careful around Mallory for 8 years, lean forward in that meeting and offer an unsolicited opinion about the Incheon position. Genuinely. Not because I was watching. Because she had created a room where that felt like the right thing to do. After the meeting, he pulled me aside. He said, the Gwangmyeong entry strategy, the way she structured the initial acquisition to avoid the regulatory flag. That was the move we missed. We kept trying to go over the wall. She found the gate. The gate isn't the door. I said, I know. He shook his head slowly. 8 years, he said. Quietly. Not as an accusation. As something closer to genuine regret. 8 years, I said. We had dinner at home a few weeks after all of this settled into its new shape. Not a significant dinner. Not a conversation with an agenda. Just the two of us, the city outside, food on the table, the ordinary texture of a shared life. Partway through, Mallory said, "I want to talk about the foundation." I said, "Tell me." The 3 facilities are stable. South Chungcheong is operating well, the new imaging equipment is being used. But there are 2 more provinces where the gap is significant. I've been looking at the funding structure and I think we can expand without compromising the Donggang returns if we're careful about the timing. She slid a document across the table. Concise. 3 pages. Analysis, projected costs, recommended sequencing. I looked at it. I looked at her. "You prepared this before dinner," I said. "I prepared it 3 days ago," she said. "I was waiting for the right moment." "You didn't need to wait," I said. She looked at me steadily. "I know that now." I read the document. I said, the second province, the entry timing. I'd push it 2 months later based on the Q3 return cycle. Otherwise the cash flow sequencing creates a gap in the fourth quarter that. "I saw that," she said. "I disagree." I looked up. She held my gaze. "If we wait 2 months, we lose the facility director they've identified. She has another offer. We can't replace that specific combination of credentials in that region within a reasonable timeline. The cash flow gap is manageable with a bridge structure I've already mapped." She slid a 4th page across the table that I hadn't seen before. The bridge structure. It was correct. She had already solved the problem I'd just raised. I put the document down. "Approved," I said. And Mallory, for the first time in this entire conversation, in all the weeks of this entire situation, smiled. Not triumphantly. Not with the satisfaction of someone who won an argument. With the specific, quiet warmth of someone who is, finally, exactly where they were always supposed to be. I'm sitting at the same desk where I first found the discrepancy in the accounts. The city is doing what it always does. Moving, indifferent, glittering through the floor-to-ceiling window. Everything outside looks the same as it did the night I sat here at midnight and felt the ground move. Everything inside is different. Donggang Holdings is operational and growing. The foundation has begun its expansion into the second province. Mallory runs 3 operational meetings a week that she did not run 3 months ago. My organization, the people in it, the culture of it, is adjusting to a reality that was always true but is only now acknowledged, that the woman I married has a mind that belongs at every table that matters, and that for 8 years, the only person who failed to act on that knowledge was me. I want to tell you what I know now that I didn't know when this started. Control is not the same as trust. I trusted Mallory, I thought I trusted Mallory, but what I actually did was trust her inside a space I had defined for her. That's not trust. That's management. Real trust is what Mallory extended to me. She moved $50 million on the belief that when I found it, I would be capable of seeing it clearly. She built something for 2 years on the assumption that I was better than my worst instincts. That I was bigger than my code. That somewhere inside the most controlled man in Seoul was a person who could be surprised by his own wife and respond with something other than force. She trusted me with a version of myself I hadn't shown her yet. And I think about what would have happened if she'd been wrong. If I had reacted the way my world expected me to react. If I had let the first version of the story, the one where $50 million missing means betrayal, means consequences, means the machinery of my world doing what it does, if I had let that version win. I don't let myself stay in that thought for too long. What I know is this, the most sophisticated operation anyone has run in my orbit in the last decade was run by my wife. In my blind spot. With my money. For my benefit. By a black woman from Atlanta who had graduated top of her class and spent 7 years in serious finance and then moved to Seoul and been asked, for 8 years, what she thought of the food. She didn't wait for the door to open. She built a company in the space between what I allowed and what I was capable of seeing. And she was right about all of it. Every single piece. Last week I came downstairs and she was already at the kitchen counter with coffee and an open laptop and a market report she was annotating in the margins. Early morning. Completely in it. She looked up when I walked in. Jeju Logistics Company. I've been watching it for 6 weeks. I think the timing is right for an approach. I poured coffee. Looked over her shoulder at the screen. She walked me through it in 4 sentences, clean, no filler, exactly the information I needed to form an initial view. I said, set a call for Thursday. She nodded and went back to the annotation. I stood there for a second with my coffee and the morning light coming through the windows, and I thought about the night 9 years ago in Singapore when we talked for 3 hours and I extended my trip by 4 days. I thought about the questions she asked me that first night, sharper than I expected, more structurally intelligent than I was prepared for. I had noticed it then. I had filed it as impressive and then, over 8 years, somehow failed to do anything with it. I thought about what it costs a person to be persistently more than what the room decides they are. To show up every day inside a life that has underestimated you and find a way, quietly, patiently, with extraordinary discipline, to expand it from the inside. Mallory had done that. For 8 years. She had done it without bitterness. Without an ultimatum. Without making me feel the full weight of what I'd failed to do until I was ready to actually hold it. That might be the most remarkable thing about all of it. Not the 50 million. Not the company. Not the foundation. That she waited for me to be ready, and she built something worth waiting for in the meantime. I keep coming back to one thing she said. The night it all came out, when I asked her why she hadn't come to me directly. She said, because you didn't have a door. I've thought about that sentence every single day since. Because here's what I know now, sitting on the other side of it. I thought I was the most dangerous person in every room I walked into. I was wrong. The most dangerous person in my life has been sitting across from me at breakfast for 8 years. And I almost missed her entirely. She didn't take $50 million from me. She invested it, in a company, in 3 clinics, and in the possibility that I was worth believing in. The return on that last one is the only one that actually matters.